Hey everyone, so in today's video, what we're going to work through are two different variations that we can utilize to try and concentrate some load into the hamstrings while facilitating a posterior pelvic rotation to relax the lumbar extensors. Now hopefully, I'm sure you're all aware by now is that one of the key features that we utilize within our approach early on with clients is trying to steer stress, particularly when we're working with clients with more proximal issues around the lumbar spine, the pelvis, is ensuring that the client has the ability to steer that stress into the lower body. I can't tell you how many people I work through on a day-to-day basis that are expressing a lot of muscle activity proximally, and one of the easiest ways to try and reduce that muscle activity is to try and bias the proximal segment into a direction that will facilitate some kind of lengthening. It doesn't have to be in its end range. So for example, you don't have to get the pelvis to rotate into its end range or the pelvis to rotate forward or backward into its end range. But you want to steer that stress into the limb. So you're almost trying to allow the nervous system to understand that, okay, there's more tissue that I can actually steer this stress into instead of expressing a lot of guarding and spasm proximally, okay? But when you're working with clients that are highly sensitive and they're experiencing a lot of pain, they can't tolerate a lot of load through those muscular tissues, through the limb, the biarticular muscles, like the hamstrings, quads, and even when you start coupling that via the plantar flexors as well. So I want to show you two variations and discuss some of the things that a lot of my clients will tell me when they're trying to get some load into the hamstrings, okay? Number one, just to briefly kind of talk to you about this before we get into the practical strategy. Number one, a lot of clients will tend to feel it in their calves a lot. You'll tend to have clients expressing a lot of muscle activity around their plantar flexors because gastrocnemius will couple with the hamstring to encourage a loaded knee flexion moment as well. So we can talk about what we can do there to reduce that knee flexion moment via the gastrocnemius. And then secondly, clients may just struggle to handle load through the hamstrings in general. Now you might say that, okay, let's just do a double leg strategy. But sometimes when you utilize a double leg strategy, it makes it very difficult for clients to use the non-target limb to facilitate a posterior pelvic rotation to actually help it. So we're using what's known as an in-phase pattern there. So we're bringing the other leg into the other hip into flexion via the femur to try and encourage that posterior rotation on the pelvis. And when you have both femurs in a 90-degree position of hip flexion, it can be quite difficult for clients, especially those clients that are really limited in that posterior pelvic rotation, okay? So I'm going to show you those two variations in the next portion of the video. Okay, so I'm set up in this 90-degree position of hip flexion, 90-degree position of knee flexion, just for demonstration purposes. But what I want to bring your attention to first is what happens when I plantar flex the ankle and when I dorsiflex the ankle. So you can see that when I plantar flex the ankle, that's going to create a little bit of knee extension. It's going to open up the space in the back of the knee. As I dorsiflex, it's almost going to bring the knee into more flexion. So it's going to almost begin to close off the space in the back of the knee. And a lot of the clients that sense that load into their kind of proximal gastrocnemius, into the back of the knee, for example, are typically those clients that when you ask them to, and again, we'd go through that little bit of a posterior tilt, trying to get that gentle squashing of the back into the floor, crush down, and then peel the pelvis off the floor, just about an inch or two. And as they're crushing down, when they dorsiflex the ankle, they'll typically struggle to feel it oftentimes in their hamstrings. They might feel it in the calves, or they might feel tension around the foot and the ankle. But what I typically encourage clients to do here then is I encourage them to just lightly plantar flex, not to the point where they're plantar flexing in the other direction, because then they'll often tell me they get a cramp in their feet, but just to lightly plantar flex, just to encourage that slackening of the plantar flexors, but also to begin to open up that space in the back of the knee, okay? So that's number one, just to try to allow the hamstrings to take on most of the demand here, okay? Because you can also consider that when the ankle's plantar flex and it drags that knee into extension, what's going to try to stop that knee from going into extension? The hamstrings. So you'll often feel that there's a stronger contraction in the hamstrings when you actually plantar flex the ankle. And you'll typically feel that more so when you do it on a single leg. So you crush down, scoop up, and if you plantar flex the ankle and just hold the ankle in plantar flexion, you'll typically feel the hamstrings begin to talk to you a little bit louder, okay? Secondly, is that you'll oftentimes have clients who are so deconditioned across the limb, the lower limb, that when they utilize a double leg strategy, they still find it very challenging, okay? What I like to do then is I like to give the clients the opportunity to use their hands, okay? So you're using your hands to assist. You're basically using shoulder extension to assist the lifting of the pelvis off the ground, okay? So what you're doing there is you're taking away some of the mass, the weight of the pelvis by pressing the hands gently into the ground, and clients can typically tolerate that much easier. But sometimes what I find is that even if the client doesn't struggle, but it seems as though they're just hanging out there and they're lacking that intent with the kick, the crushing of the heel into the block. That's really important. You want the client to, when they're up here, they're not just holding, but I want them to be intentional with digging the heel into the block here. And sometimes just reducing that awareness or that need to kind of control the pelvis proximally by pressing the hands gently into the ground just gives them that intention, or kind of opens up that opportunity for them to just think about crushing the heels into the ground. And we can typically extend the duration of the contraction for much longer, which I find a lot more helpful for clients in the early stages. Sometimes you'll have a client where they'll crush down, they'll scoop up and they'll hold, and by 10-15 seconds they're really struggling, okay? Is that really helpful at that point in time? Probably not. I want to expose them to lower loads over longer durations during the early phases. So if they're getting to 15 seconds and they're struggling, or even 20 seconds, I'd like to almost have clients do this for 60 seconds. But I want to make sure that they're feeling fatigued and they feel like the hamstrings are moderately fatigued at 60 seconds. Particularly when it's in session with me and I just want to give them that experience of what it feels like. So I'll use the hands as much as I need to. And lastly here, what I also like to do is if the client really struggles with that posterior pelvic rotation, sometimes when the client still struggles with the double leg, and you know that if you were to ask them to lift that other leg off the ground, there's no way they'd be able to do it. That's where the hands come in really handy. Hands come in handy. So you want them to bring the knees to the chest. That knee to the chest here encourages the pelvis to go into a posterior rotation. But if the client really struggles to get the hip off the ground, or the pelvis off the ground, allow them to use their hands. You can have them use their elbows if they want. I just find it's easier for clients to use their hands to gently press in and scoop up. And all of a sudden, when they couldn't lift, now they can lift. They can plantar flex their ankle if they need. And it just gives them the opportunity then to extend the duration. So now they can crush that heel down into the ground. It's just nice to bring that intent into the heel and be able to extend that for longer durations. I find clients just get a lot better benefit with experiencing that load through the hamstrings for a longer duration instead of just trying to fight as hard as they can, clench their teeth, hold their breath just to get 15 seconds of a contraction. Now, of course, it's a very early stage, low loading strategy, but I find that when clients are very irritable, clients are very sensitive, that simple pressing into the ground with the hands has been an absolute game changer for me on many, many occasions. And then the other little tip there with the plantar flexion is extremely handy as well, just to allow them to feel like the calves aren't contributing as much. Sometimes in clients that have such deconditioned hamstrings, you may have to say to them, look, I don't mind if you feel it a little bit in the calf, but I don't want you to only feel it in the calf. I want you to feel it in the calf and the hamstring. So I'm fine with you feeling it in the calf as long as the hamstring is also working as well. Just as a last little tip there, if they still struggle with it, then what I'll typically do is I'll take them out of this 90-degree knee flex position and I'll move them a little bit higher or further away from it, just so we can actually shift a bit more demand into the more proximal hamstring and maybe into the glute a little bit as well. So yes, we're moving the knees further away. We're bringing the femurs further away from the pelvis, which you may conceptually think, okay, that's going to make it harder for me to posterior rotate. But not if I bring the femur up and not if I use the hands. And very often they'll say, oh, I feel a lot more hamstring now, a lot less calf, because you're adding in a knee flexion and hip extension component. So again, just a couple of different variations that I found came in very, very handy when you know the client has very poor force generation through the hamstrings. and you're trying to shift that demand into those tissues while simultaneously reducing the muscle guarding, the muscle activity proximally. These just give you the opportunity to allow that to be done, even if they're very deconditioned and they can't even do it on a double leg, and if they can't even do it on a single leg. Okay, so give those a go and let me know how you feel or how it goes with your clients.